Hi everyone, I'm Ellie from Ellie's Exotics, and today I'm going to be doing a Pacman Frog Care Guide. I have had a couple of Pacman Frogs now, and I absolutely adore them. Honestly, anyone that comes into the reptile room, whether they are an avid exotic animal keeper or not, Big Mac is always their favourite animal. So I thought I would do a care guide on them because they are definitely becoming more popular as a pet, and I don't blame people who want to get one. Now, just like any care guide, this is a guide. This should not be your only source of information. Please make sure you do lots and lots of research before bringing an animal home, and that's everything. Let's get right into the video. So the first topic is temperament. How is your animal going to act? Big Mac, he is very different from my old Pacman frog, Derek, in the fact that he loves food more than the average Pacman frog. Anything, and I mean anything, that moves in his enclosure, he is going to try and bite. This makes for a hilarious but also kind of stressful pet. When I needed to move him from his old enclosure to his new one, it was a stressful task, and I wanted to walk away with all 10 of my fingers. Because when they do bite, it really hurts. It really does hurt. They have sharp serrated teeth, so a bite from a baby Pacman might not hurt that much because the teeth are little, but as they get bigger, that bite force will just hurt even more, and they tend not to let go if they do bite. But bites should be rare because you should not really be handling your Pacman frog at all. There are a lot of videos on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube of people handling their Pacman frogs or putting their Pacman frogs in weird situations. Just leave them in their enclosure and take them out every couple weeks for a soak. And if you have to handle them for whatever reason, always use gloves and make sure the gloves are wet. Pacman frogs breathe and drink through their skin, so anything on our hands like oils, soap, hand sanitizer, that is going to injure our frog and make them very poorly. Pacman frogs are even more sensitive than most frogs, like compared to a White's tree frog. They can put up with that a little bit better, but Pacman frogs, it's an absolute no-go. You have to wear gloves. So for the age range, Pacman frogs will live 10 to 15 years, which I think is the perfect age range for an exotic animal. When you start getting into the 30-40 year commitment, then it can be a bit more overwhelming, but I think a 10 to 15 year commitment for an animal like a Pacman frog is the perfect amount of time. Now, size-wise, the males do stay quite a bit smaller than the females. The males can get 3 to 4 inches long, so you would be looking at this size enclosure permanently, which is a 60 by 40, but if you can go bigger, then that is always better. They do utilize space. And for females, they can actually grow up to 8 inches long. That is a big frog, and you rarely see them get that big, but I have seen a couple of them, and that's what I want. I want a huge Pacman frog. So if you were to get a female that grows to that size, you'd be looking at a 3 to 4 foot enclosure. Now, one thing that I wasn't expecting and that I didn't experience with my last Pacman frog because I got him as an adult is just how fast they grow. I initially put Big Mac into his baby enclosure, and he outgrew that enclosure within 2 months of owning him. He went from this big to this big in 2 months. So if I were you and I were bringing home a baby Pacman frog, I would literally just put them straight into their adult enclosure. They are so fast growing, they eat so much food that enclosure will not seem like a giant mansion in very long. So speaking of the enclosure, like I said, you're going to be looking at roughly on average a 3-foot vivarium for a Pacman frog, and I like to go for the low enclosures because Pacman frogs are not very good at climbing. I don't want them to get injured if they were to climb up too high and fall. because they are quite fragile animals. So I go for the Exoterra lows, and I also like to go for those because of heating, but I'll get into that in a little bit. Now, inside your enclosure, you want to provide lots of clutter and hiding opportunities. Leaf litter is a great way to keep in humidity and also allow them to hide. But I also like to provide one large piece of cork bark, and I create almost a little burrow inside of it. This allows my Pacman frog to get out of the UVB and the heating if they want to. And it also provides a cooler spot for them if they wanted to cool themselves down. My enclosure is also bioactive, so what this means is it has isopods, springtails, and plants. Now, this enclosure hasn't been set up very long, so he might end up ripping out all of the plants. We'll just have to see, but I know bioactive enclosures are very common with Pacman frogs, so it's definitely doable. Those plants create great coverage for your Pacman frog so that they don't feel vulnerable when they're sitting in their little ditch, because that's what they tend to do in the daytime. They will just find a little hole in the ground and they'll sit in there all day. At nighttime, that's when they're going to come out and hop around. People that say Pacman frogs don't do anything are lying, because I can literally hear Big Mac throwing himself against the glass at night trying to get food. For substrate, there are a couple of different options. You want to avoid frog foam. I see this being used very commonly on other social media platforms like Instagram, but frog foam is not a suitable substrate for Pacman frogs. They need to be able to burrow. They will burrow to cool their bodies down. So for substrate, I like to use topsoil because I have live plants, and if I needed a boost of humidity, I would also mix in cocoa fiber. People generally tend to use cocoa fiber on its own, but I don't really like to use cocoa fiber on its own. I think it's far too unnatural, and it also can be hard to digest when it is dry. So a mix of topsoil and cocoa fiber, 70% topsoil, 30% cocoa fiber, is going to work out best. I also see people using moss. Moss is an absolute no-go for Pacman frogs. They will very easily get impacted if it is swallowed, and they will swallow just about anything that is in their enclosure, especially during feeding time. So you want to avoid moss, especially with the tiny Pacman frogs. Now let's talk about heating and UVB. So Pacman frogs, like I said, if they have it too hot, they will pass away. So you want to find that perfect balance where they are going to stay warm enough so that they continue eating, because they will stop eating if they're too cold, but not overheat. So I keep Big Mac at about 25 degrees. A lot of people say that they don't need a basking spot and that they don't need any heating. Here in the UK, they do. Okay, so all of that advice is usually coming from Americans or people in warmer climates. Here in the UK, we have to provide that basking spot, otherwise they just won't eat. Just like I do with reptiles, I recommend overhead heating for Pacman frogs. It's the most natural way for them to digest their food. I use a 50-watt basking bulb inside of a dome that is over the top of mesh so that he can't get to the bulb and injure himself. I see some people using heat mats on the side, which can be fine. I would definitely use that for a baby Pacman frog, but as your Pacman frog gets bigger and older and they're going to be eating bigger meals, they're going to need more help with digestion. So use that overhead heating bulb. Never ever place a heat mat on the bottom of the enclosure. Heat comes from the sun, it doesn't come from the ground, and it is a very quick way to overheat your Pacman frog. Make sure your heat is connected to a thermostat. If you are using a heat mat on the side for a baby, then connect it to an on and off stat. And if you are using a basking bulb for your adult, then connect it to a dimming thermostat. They are two different types of thermostats and they have two different jobs. Place the thermostat probe about 3 inches away from your basking spot so that your temperatures are not too high or too low. Now, as for UVB, this can be a controversial topic with Pacman frogs, but I have seen a lot of Pacman frogs developing metabolic bone disease recently. You can dust your feeders with as much calcium as you like, and they still seem to be getting bone issues. And that's because without UVB, it can be very hard for your frog to process that calcium, break that calcium down, and actually get the benefits from the calcium powder. Pacman frogs have a huge skeleton, and it's very common that you start to see MBD form around the jaw of the Pacman frog and also in the back legs. So when providing UVB, you want to give them a 2.4% UVB unit if they are an albino Pacman frog. This is because it can be harder for them to see, and the stronger percentage bulbs can injure their eyes, so go for a 2.4%. If you have any other type of Pacman frog, then you can go for a 7% shade dweller unit by Arcadia, and if you already have multiple units, you can actually link them all together. Now let's talk about humidity. Your humidity should go up to about 80% and even higher. Mine goes up to 90, 100% for a couple hours after misting, and then it will go down to roughly about 60% during the day. I mist Big Mac twice a day, once in the morning, once at night, and I have found that that's what keeps him nice and healthy. Now, one thing that I have found recently when offering humidity advice is that people are saying, I'm misting and misting and misting. My enclosure is literally like soaking wet, but my hygrometer is saying that it's only 40%. And that's because a lot of hygrometers, whether digital or analog, can actually be quite inaccurate. So a good way to measure humidity for high humidity species is just go off of the substrate. If the substrate will clump together in your hand and hold its shape, then that's perfect. If it is running out of your hand like that and it's not holding a shape, then it's too dry. And if it's dripping water, then it's too wet. But generally speaking, if your enclosure is a little bit too wet, it will dry out eventually, and it being that wet for an hour or two is not going to harm your Pacman frog. They will soak up most of the moisture through their skin to hydrate themselves instead of using a water bowl, but make sure we are still providing a water bowl for them just in case they want to use it. Mine tends to just use his as a toilet. Now let's talk about feeding. Trying to research how to feed your Pacman frog and what to feed them has genuinely been the most confusing thing that I've done over the last 2 years, because people say so many different things. One thing that you might hear is that mealworms and crickets will eat through the stomach of your Pacman frog. I don't know how true that is, but it definitely sounds very extreme. But crickets shouldn't really be your main feeder for your Pacman frog anyway. I feed Big Mac twice a week, and his main food source is night crawlers or lobworms. These are very big, soft worms, and they make the perfect meal for a Pacman frog because they're very easy to digest. He also gets locusts as a treat every now and then. Locusts are his absolute favorite, but if he has too many of them, then he can become impacted. So he only gets them like if I'm recording a video, because he usually goes crazy for them. So he gets them every now and then, no more than once a week. Another food source that you can feed them that I have offered him a few times is silver sides, which is a type of fish. He also really likes the fish too, and this is very easy for him to digest. Some foods to avoid, like I said, are things like crickets, mealworms, Morio worms, and not because they're going to eat through your Pacman frog, but just because they don't have the right nutritional value. Crickets are too low in fat, and mealworms and Morio worms are very high in fat. Same with pinkies. So I give Big Mac pinkies every now and then. You know, I'm not going to say that I never do. If Marmite misses a meal, then he gets a pinky. I would say maybe once a month he gets one, but it's very common for Pacman frogs to actually only want to eat pinkies, and pinkies can be very hard to digest because of how big their skull is. So only feed them as a treat if you have one left over. Don't feed your Pacman frog things like rodents, chicks, quail as their main feeders, because they are prone to fatty liver disease and they will pass away very quickly. So it's easier to prevent it by feeding the right feeders and the lowest fat feeders than trying to fix it further down the line. And the last topic is availability. It is very easy to get a Pacman frog, but it actually can be quite hard to get a healthy Pacman frog. This has nothing to do with the breeders currently producing Pacman frogs. It is genuinely just the circle of life. When Pacman frogs lay a whole bunch of eggs, they are not expecting all of those eggs to survive. But because we are basically stepping in and trying to raise all of these eggs anyway, normal and natural that every now and then a few frogs will just fail to thrive. And it can actually be hard to spot that before they even go on sale to people, especially if you're buying a baby Pacman frog. You never know if something is wrong internally that just didn't form right when they were growing from a tadpole to a froglet to a frog, and it's not the breeder's fault if they were sold to you and there was something wrong inside that neither of you could spot and they do pass away. If you want to try and avoid this, then you can get an adult Pacman frog, but I do highly recommend getting a baby. It's so fun to watch them grow and watch them get bigger. They are just adorable little animals and raising them is super rewarding. So availability wise, they are easy to find. You just have to be careful and watch out for any signs of failure to thrive. Price wise, it really varies. You could pay like £5 for a Pacman frog all the way up to like £300. It really depends on what color you want, but Big Mac, he is a Pikachu Pacman frog and he was £40, which I really don't think is that bad at all, especially since the Pikachu Pacman frog or the two-spot Pacman frog is very, very popular. So that is everything for today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video and I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions about Pacman frogs, then just comment down below and I will be more than happy to help, and let me know what your Pacman frog's name is. Make sure you like and you subscribe and I will see you all later. Bye bye.